Hi, everybody. Dr. Kelly here again, and welcome to the next lecture of New Testament History and Religion. Decided to do a little virtual background, and there is the beautiful PLNU campus. All right. But anyway, yeah, the title of today's lecture is What is the New Testament and From Where Did It Come? Part 2. And we'll be talking about the canon and historical context. Some exciting stuff to get into today. So a couple friendly reminders again. Make sure you're paying good attention to the syllabus and the assignments. Make sure you've got taking good notes, that is, on these lectures, both what I'm saying and what's on the screen. And then once again, make sure you have your New Interpreter Study Bible. Oh gosh, you can't see it on the virtual background. There it is. New Interpreter Study Bible with you and ready to use when you watch these video lectures. All right, in a moment I'll share my screen and get the PowerPoint going, but let me pray for us and we'll dive in. Lord, as we study origins and backgrounds of the people who followed you, the people of God early on, and the writings of the New Testament early on, we realize the complexities of living in this world. And we pray that you would make us more attuned to the complexities of our day, whether that be poverty or injustice, whether it just be hardships of making a life, whether it be illness and pandemics. Would you help us to know that you continue to be at work in and through the complexities of our world, and you call your people into those things as instruments of grace and peace. Teach us a little bit more about that as we study the backgrounds of early Christians and the New Testament writings. And we pray this in the name of the one who stands at the center of all of that, Jesus, the Messiah. Amen. Okay, so let me go ahead and minimize our view of Point Loma here and screen share for you the PowerPoint for today. All right, get that going and give you a little bit of a view here. All right, there we go. So as I said a moment ago, the topic of today's lecture, what is the New Testament and from where did it come, part 2, and particularly talking about canon and historical context. And so let me just kind of note what we're doing here. We're continuing essentially what we were doing last lecture, talking about from where did the New Testament come, especially that other side of the coin. Think about the New Testament as ancient literature. So last lecture, if you think back, last lecture we talked about several things. Talked about how is the New Testament different from the Old Testament. We talked about the New Testament as an anthology, and we talked about the general process of the origins and composition of the writings of the New Testament. I want to start by giving you a little bit of a visual recap. Here's what we've been trying to say so far. All right, there we go. Kind of looks like this. If you think of this as a visual recap, basically what we're trying to do is talk about the New Testament then and now. So the New Testament then was various writings from different writers and contexts between about 50 and 150 AD or CE. The New Testament now, as we have it today, is a standardized list of 27 books and an authoritative anthology of scripture or canon. So what we're trying to do in these first couple of lectures here is ask, how did we get from then to now with the New Testament? In other words, how did we get from various writings from different writers and contexts between 50 and 150 AD, how did we get from that to a standardized list of 27 books, an authoritative anthology of scripture that we call the New Testament? So let's start a little bit with the now and talk about the canon of the New Testament. All right, the canon of the New Testament. Remember how we defined the word canon before. Remember the word canon, whenever you hear it, means a standardized collection of literature that is authoritative for a believing community. That's its canon. So here's the key that I want you to note as we get into this today. The key is that, and look at our chart again, even though the New Testament writings were written by about the middle of the 2nd century, right, about 150 AD, The formation of an authoritative standardized collection or canon of books was the result of a long process that didn't become complete until about the 4th century AD, about the 300s AD. So we're talking about a long process of what, 2 or 3 centuries from the time the New Testament writings were written until the time we have a final standardized authoritative canon called the New Testament, from about the mid-1st century all the way to about the mid-4th century CE, 300s AD. Now, here's a big slide that I want us to kind of walk through a little bit. What happened along the way of this long process? So along the way, there's a few things that are interesting as you watch this development from then to now. First thing is, along the way of that process between the 1st and 4th centuries CE, we have different lists that have survived where the early church was trying to discern which of these early Christian writings were authoritative canon and which were not. So we've got a number of different canon lists that appear from between about the 1st and the mid-4th century. Give you an example, you can see one of them on the screen. One such list is called the Muratorian Canon. The Muratorian Canon comes either from the late 2nd or early 3rd century. So in the middle of this process, it's in Latin. It was probably translated from Greek, but it's in Latin. And what's interesting about it is it's a list. It's a canon list of the authoritative books, but it's not the one we eventually ended up with. The Muratorian Canon has, on its list of a New Testament canon, it has the 4 Gospels. It has 13 letters of Paul, no Hebrews. It has Jude, 1st and 2nd John, and Revelation. But then it also has some books that were popular at the time, but didn't eventually make it into the canon of the New Testament. So books like the Wisdom of Solomon, the Revelation of Peter, these kind of things. So it's a good example that along the way between the 1st and 4th centuries, we have these different lists where the church was trying to discern which of the writings are authoritative canon and which aren't. Here's another thing during the long process. Remember that different parts of the New Testament achieved authoritative canonical status at different times. It wasn't the same for every book. And sometimes in different places, books were considered authoritative before other books. And then the third thing during the long process is, and this might be new to some of you, remember that there were a lot of early Christian writings between the 1st and 4th centuries that were very popular in the church, but did not ultimately end up becoming part of the final New Testament canon. So there's lots of examples of these. You see some of them on the screen there, like First Clement, the Didache, a work called The Shepherd of Hermas. By the way, if you want to explore some of these, that's what the extra credit paper on early non-canonical Christian documents allows you to do. So go back and see the syllabus if you want. There's an extra credit paper in there. It's optional, but it's on these early Christian writings that were popular in the church, but didn't eventually become part of the authoritative New Testament canon. Okay, so how did it all end? How did the process come to an end? Look at the bottom of the screen there. The big finish was by about the year 367 AD, so the middle of the 4th century AD, Athanasius, who's a bishop of Alexandria in Egypt. So think of someone who is in Egypt, someone from the Egyptian. Athanasius was Bishop of Alexandria in Egypt. He shows us a list that is the first time we see all 27 books that now make up our New Testament all put together. So we assume that that was the end of the process, that by 367, by the middle of the 4th century, we see this list from Athanasius that is the first time we see what we now know of as the 27 books of the Old Testament. The New Testament. So an interesting question to follow up on this would be, okay, how did these 27 books that we see in our table of contents today, how did these 27 books come to achieve canonical status? So there's a couple things I hope you see from looking at this long process. Number one, it wasn't because of a one-time single decree or decision. It was the result of a long and complicated process. Just pause for a second for a fun example. Y'all know how much I love the band U2. You know that already. Here's a good example of the canonical process. What if I asked us as a group to work together to come up with a list of the 5 most significant songs by U2? Like, out of all the hundreds of songs they've written, what if I said, we're going to work together, we're going to come up with a list of the 5 most significant songs by them? Think about it. What would we have to talk about? What would that conversation look like? How would we decide? I mean, for example, we'd have to talk about the word significant. What do we mean by significant? Do you mean favorite? Do you mean impactful? Do you mean it sounds great? Quality? You know, what do you mean by significant? What are the criteria that we're going to use to decide? Think about, we'd have to have some compromise, some give and take, right? I'll give you that one, but I got to have this one. You know, that's what we're talking about. The same kind of process and dynamics went on in this process of canonization of the New Testament. But what we can identify is that there were 2, what you might call sort of main catalysts that the church used to decide on whether a book made it into the canon or not. Okay, there's a couple catalysts that seem to have been at work from what we can tell from looking back on their writings. The first catalyst for whether a book made it into the canon or not was criteria for the different writings, just some deciding criteria to evaluate the different writings. And the criteria that the church most often talks about having used is a couple things. One is use by the churches. Like, in other words, is this a book, is this a writing that was already popular, that was already being used and seen as authoritative? If so, that helps to get in the canon. A second thing is if the writing was somehow associated with the apostles, the 12 earliest followers of Jesus, or their teachings, if it was consistent with their teachings in some way, that helped it get into the canon. So there were others, but there were some criteria they used to evaluate the canonical status of these books. And 2 of them were they being used by the churches? And are they associated with an apostle, or are they in line with the teachings of the apostles? The other criteria that surfaces a lot that they seem to have used was responding to heresies. Responding to heresy. Now, if you don't know what heresy means, heresy is basically was an unorthodox teaching, like a challenge to the kind of orthodox traditional teachings of the church. And there were a lot of different heresies that popped up between the 1st and 4th century. And responding to these challenges to traditional teaching was one of the things that helped solidify the canon. So I give you just one quick example you can see on the screen there. Just one example of one of these crises was a crisis with an early Christian leader named Marcion. He was living back in the 2nd century, died about 160 AD or CE. Marcion floated this idea that he believed that the God of the Old Testament was a different God than the God of the New Testament. And so for the canon, he argued that Christians, he rejected the entire Old Testament. And he said the only part of the New Testament that should be canon is some parts of the Gospel of Luke, and then some of Paul's letters. And that was it. And in response to this, the church basically came along and said, that's too narrow of a canon. So the church affirmed the canonical authoritative status of the Old Testament and said, no, we want 4 gospels, not just one gospel in our canon. So that's an example of the kind of, like, by responding to heresies, it helped to form the canon. So what I want you to get out of this is, what was this canonical process? A long unfolding process between about the 1st and mid-4th century, but by the mid-4th century, 200 or 300 years after the New Testament writings were actually written, with Athanasius in 367 AD, we have what seems to be the list of, okay, these 27 books that we now know today are the New Testament. Okay, we'll pause for a second there, take a drink, hit pause, check out a YouTube video, come back. Okay, shifting gears now a little bit, we want to go into the second piece and the major piece we want to do for today, which is to introduce something that I've mentioned a couple times in previous lectures, and it's going to be with us the whole rest of the course, and that is what I'd like to call the history grid for the New Testament writings. Now, quickly, let me say, you can find a handout of this under the Files tab on Canvas. So if you want to have it and you want to look at it not just on a PowerPoint, but like as a handout to see on your screen, or if you want to print it out, go under the Files tab on Canvas and you'll look for the history grid there and you can pull it up. You can even hit pause now and go do it if you want. All right, so this will be, like I said, one of the most important things we will use all semester as we talk about different books in the New Testament. So first, remember that when we're talking about the idea that the New Testament is an anthology, remember that? Okay. We said that the individual books in the New Testament and the individual authors come from different historical eras within early Christianity between about the 50s to the 100s AD. And that each of those different eras had different issues, different concerns, different audiences, and that shaped the different books of the New Testament. So here's my proposal that I want to give to you and have you think about it, and that's what this history grid's all about. My proposal is that it's absolutely crucial to be able to locate each of the New Testament books on our history grid of the eras of the church's development between the mid-first and mid-second century AD. I think this is especially important for understanding what the different books say, why they say it, and why they say it in the ways that they say it. But it's also, and catch this, it's also helpful for understanding why different New Testament writings seem sometimes to disagree with each other or have different perspectives on things. It's because these different books and their authors come from different eras within early Christianity between about the mid-first and mid-second century AD. And those different eras had different issues, concerns, audiences, and all that. So here's the plan, building from that. The plan is that we're going to try to put into place this history grid and hang on to it. Know it, love it, use it, treasure it, keep it under your pillow, whatever. But the grid, as you'll see here, I put it up, and again, if you want to see this in handout form, go under the Files tab and bring it up. But this is what it is. So the history grid is going to give us a couple things. The first thing is it's going to give us the big picture. The big picture is these three overlapping broad contexts for the emergence of early Christianity and the New Testament writings. So it's going to give us the big picture, and then it's going to go on from that to give us three specific eras of early Christianity into which we can plug the different 27 books of the New Testament. Okay, so today what I want to do is just do a quick overview, just kind of put the big picture in place, and then just begin to go through the parts of the history grid, and we'll keep on doing this as we go forward. And later, like I said, when we get to each book of the New Testament, we'll talk about where it fits in the different eras of our history grid. But just fast for now, take a look at what's on the screen. The history grid, first thing we talk about is three overlapping broad contexts, historical context for early Christianity and the New Testament writings in the first century CE, first century AD. So notice the broadest context at the top there is what we call Hellenism. Hellenism means the dominance of Greek culture and Greek thought from about the time of 333 BCE with Alexander the Great and on down. So Hellenism, we have this dominance of Greek culture, Greek thought in the Mediterranean world. Then notice within that, just off to the right there, the second circle, we have the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire in the first century AD. So Rome, based out of Italy, right, had an empire that really from about 64 BCE and on down for the area around Syria, Palestine, was Rome dominated. So they continued Hellenism, they continued Greek thought and culture, but they also morphed it in ways. So this is what we refer to, as you can see in the top circle there, as the Greco-Roman world. So if you hear someone refer to that, that's what we mean. In the 1st century AD, the Greco-Roman world was this sort of Greek culture and influence, but under the political dominance of the Roman Empire. The Greco-Roman world in the 1st century AD. And then notice the third overlapping context there, the green circle for early Christianity in the New Testament writings, is Judaism in the 1st century, or the Jewish world in the 1st century in Syria, Palestine. Specifically, we'll talk about this later, but this is what we call Second Temple Judaism. So it's Judaism was prominent from about 515 BCE all the way up to about 70 AD in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans. And a key element within the Jewish world of the 1st century, you see listed there, is what we call apocalyptic thought. So we'll have a lot more to say about that later. But these, if you just kind of push back and look at these, these are the 3 overlapping historical contexts for early Christianity in the writings of the New Testament. Okay, in the 1st century AD, you have Hellenism, the Greco-Roman world, you have the political dominance of the Roman Empire over Syria, Palestine, and then you have the Jewish world. Judaism in 1st century Syria, Palestine, with particularly Second Temple Judaism and the prominence of apocalyptic thought. Okay, hopefully you're with me so far. Again, you can have the handout under the Files tab if you want. But here's what I want to do. With these kind of overlapping broad contexts then, on the grid, go 3 very specific eras of the development of early Christianity and the writings of the New Testament. So in fact, if you look on the handout, the other part of it, you can see these 3 eras. And we're not going to go through the details of them now. I just want you to see what they are, because we'll come back to these as we look at different books of the New Testament. So era 1 in the middle of this, we'll say, is from 30 to 50 AD or CE. Okay. Era 2, we'll say, is from 50 to 70 AD. And then era 3, we'll say, is from 70 up to about 100 AD. Okay, so the idea is that these different eras had different things going on. And different books of the New Testament come from different eras in these. Some come from era 1, some come from era 2, some come from era 3. And we'll be plugging those in as we go. Okay, pausing here. What I want to do with the rest of this lecture, before I run out of time, is do kind of start in on the big picture stuff. That is, I want to talk particularly about the big picture, part 1, being Hellenism and the Greco-Roman world, right? What's going on with all that? Hellenism, the Greek influence and culture, and the dominance of the Roman Empire around the area of Palestine in the 1st century. Okay, so we'll keep going on this in later lectures, but I want to get a start on the big picture, part 1 today. Don't forget to stay hydrated. All right. Okay, so here we go. Thinking again about the context of early Christianity in the New Testament writings. By the way, look at the map. If you're not familiar with what we're talking about, this is the Mediterranean world. You can see the Mediterranean Sea. You can see the boot that comes out. That's Italy, where Rome and the Roman Empire was based. And if you go all the way down, see if the arrow will show up here, down here, right? This is where the area of Palestine, Syria, Palestine, ancient Israel was. So Jerusalem, that area is all down in here where we're talking about Jesus and early Christianity starting out. Okay, so the broadest context, as we said, the broadest context for early Christianity and the writings of the New Testament is what we call Hellenism. Remember, we said Hellenism means the dominance of Greek culture and Greek thought from the time of Alexander the Great, about 330 BCE, all the way into the 100s CE or AD. And within that, remember, the other context was the Roman Empire. So from about 64 BCE for the area of Syria, Palestine on down, they continued Hellenism, but now you have the dominance of the Roman Empire. And that gives us what we call then the Greco-Roman world, everything you see shaded in pink there. So the point is, the reason I'm dwelling on this, right? The point is, this provides a big chunk of the political and social context of the New Testament and the religious and philosophical thought world of the early Christians. So if you want to read the New Testament well, got to know something about that. So as we talk about Hellenism in the Greco-Roman world, The big time period here for us is from about 330 BCE all the way into the 100s AD. This was the period of Greek and Roman dominance that we call the Greco-Roman world. So catch this, because this is interesting. I know you're seeing maybe some connections here with history courses you're taking, but catch this for our purposes. By the time of Jesus and the New Testament, the Mediterranean world that you see on the map there had been under the influence of Greek culture for about 400 years. And more recently had come under the political dominance of the Roman Empire. That's the world you're stepping into when you talk about early Christianity, the writings of the New Testament. For 400 years, they've been dominated by Greek culture. And recently, they'd come under the dominance of the Roman Empire. But again, all of these contexts were interrelated. They were all intertwined. And then you got to add into that the Jewish world, Judaism, Second Temple Judaism in the first century. So let's talk politics. No, not that kind of politics. Let's talk, but remember to vote. Okay, let's talk about the critical political moments of, speaking of politics, the critical political moments of the first century in the Greco-Roman world. So let's start with the time before the New Testament, okay? So before the first century AD. How do we think about the major political moments that took place before the first century AD, before we get to the time of the New Testament? So backing way up, remember that the first major thing happened back in 332 BCE, and that's when Alexander the Great established the Greek Empire. This is the birth of that Hellenism or Greek culture, even down into Palestine that we were talking about. And Greek influence shows up in all kinds of ways: language, architecture, gymnasiums, literature, all kinds of things. Then what happened next is overall, from 332 all the way down to about 175 BCE was the dominance of Palestine by competing Greek kings after Alexander's death. The result of that was a lot of division among Jews at the time between groups that we call the Hellenizers and the Hasidim, right? A lot of the division was over accommodation. How much can we accommodate to Greek culture, right? And how much do we need to resist Greek culture? Kind of a struggle between like the old liners and the new liners or whatever. But it also led to a number of significant conflicts between the 300s and the 100s, between Jews in Palestine and the Greek kings, the Greek Empire. I want to give you one example of the most famous of those. Things between Jews and the Greek Empire came to a head in 167 to 164 BCE. Again, this is before the time of the New Testament. This came to a head in something you may have heard of, something called the Maccabean Revolt. This was a Jewish revolt that basically recaptured the temple in Jerusalem from the Greeks and then rededicated the temple in about 166, 168, somewhere right around there. This, by the way, is the origin of the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. It's celebrating the word Hanukkah, the verb Hanak in Hebrew means to dedicate. So Hanukkah is basically a celebration of this recapturing and rededicating of the temple from the Greeks in the Jewish Maccabean revolt back in 167 to 164. So there's one example of the tensions that were prevalent between Jews and the Greek Empire. Then things changed significantly right before the beginning of the time of the first century. Things changed significantly in 63 BCE. From 63 BCE all the way down to about 4 BCE, we have now the Roman rule in Palestine. So remember, about 63 BCE, the Romans came to take over Palestine, especially with Pompey's capture of Jerusalem in 63. Right? Now, why is this significant, even though it's before the time of the first century? The Roman takeover of Palestine, beginning in 63 and on down, led to the emergence of someone named Herod the Great. Maybe you've heard that name if you have any familiarity with the New Testament, or you've been in some Christmas pageants or whatever. But Herod the Great was a half Jew from Idumean who became the king of Judea, sort of sponsored by the Romans. And he did lots of Greco-Roman influence. He did like a massive extension of the temple in Jerusalem, all that. And then Herod the Great died in 4 BC. 4 BC. Okay, so that, if you look at what's on the screen, that's sort of the critical political moments from the time before the New Testament, before the first century, especially the dominance, then the coming to power of Roman rule over Palestine and the elevation of Herod the Great as the leader there in Judea, who would then die in 4 BC. Okay, what about then, let's go to the next moment. What about critical political moments? What about the time of Jesus's actual life? Okay, so remember, we're talking here, this would be from about like 1 up to about the 30s CE or AD. That was the time that Jesus actually lived. So remember, for us, this is before the first era on our history grid. This is before the first era of early Christianity in the New Testament writing. This is the time of Jesus's actual life. So what we know is that Jesus was born sometime before the death of Herod the Great in 4 BCE. I know it seems a little weird to have Jesus born in BC, right? But actually was. Remember, all those calendars are later calculations made by monks and stuff, so they just got the year wrong. Jesus's birth should have been 4 BCE, but anyway, Jesus dies right around the time of the death of Herod the Great. I'm sorry, Jesus is born right around the time of the death of Herod the Great in 4 BCE. What happened, though, that was significant is after Herod the Great's death, the territory of Palestine split into, as you can see on the map here, Galilee in the north and Judea and Jerusalem in the south. And they were governed differently. During Jesus' lifetime, Galilee in the north was governed by the descendants of Herod the Great, particularly a guy named Herod Antipas. And Judea and Jerusalem in the south were governed directly by a Roman prefect named Pilate. And this was the situation during Jesus' lifetime. Now, this will not be the situation during most of the time of the New Testament and the later Christians, but during Jesus' lifetime, between about 1 to about the 30s, this was the situation. Okay, you have Galilee in the north governed by Herod Antipas, and Jerusalem, Judea in the south governed by Pilate as a Roman prefect. Remember, Jesus was from the north. Jesus grew up in Nazareth, around Galilee, so that's where he spent his time. Okay, so that's all I want to say really about the critical political moments that kind of lead up to the dominance of the Greco-Roman era and the Roman Empire. Let's shift for a second to talk now not about politics, but about the social world, society. Let's talk about Greco-Roman and Hellenistic society. What was the social world like? These are some pictures, by the way, that I snapped when I was at ancient Jerash, which is in modern-day Jordan. As you can see, some really impressive Roman and other related amphitheater and architectures there, things like that. So what about the social world? So remember that early Christianity existed in the overlapping social contexts of Palestine, Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey, Greece, and Rome. Right? That was the social context of early Christianity. Now, obviously, we can't give a full history for all of those like we just did for Palestine, because each of those regions and sometimes each city had its own history. But we can identify some main social features of life in the Mediterranean world in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, CE. Let's talk about them. First thing to think about with regard to the social world is that the first Christians were, including the New Testament writers, were almost all Jews. This is really important to remember. The first Christians, including all the New Testament writers, were almost all Jewish by background. We'll talk more about that later. You get the chance to read some about it. But remember, though, this was Hellenized Judaism. That is Judaism under Greek influence, so the use of Greek language, so on and so forth. But it's important to remember. Okay? Second thing, most Christian communities were located in cities. Right? In cities. This means, think about what that means, you have a significant mix of different backgrounds in churches. So you've got a number of different types of people like you would have in a big city grouped together in these early churches. Also, living in a city came with a sort of felt need to belong. You know, societies had lots, at the time, had lots of clubs, lots of gymnasiums, guilds of workers, religious associations. So in a city, there's this kind of felt need to, to belong. But remember that, again, many of the earliest Christians were Jews, and Jews, as they are today, were often very alienated from civic life in the Greco-Roman world because they didn't fit in. They were alienated by religious practices, dietary laws, other kinds. So they were ostracized a lot. That's part of the social world of early Christians and early Christianity. And then the third thing to mention is most Christians early on were either poor or what we might call sort of middle class. Right? In other words, there was a lot of wealth and poverty, kind of class divisions and issues among early Christians. There was a small number of Christians, maybe, who were from what we would call sort of the upper social classes. And this caused all kinds of conflicts in churches, as it still does today and in society today. And we see that talked about in some of the New Testament books. But for example, you might think about how Paul in 1 Corinthians 1:26 says to the Christians in Corinth, not many of you were wise, not many of you were powerful, not many of you were of noble birth, right? I mean, this is sort of who they were. A really good example of this is the language that the New Testament was originally written in. The New Testament is written in Greek, but it's a particular type of Greek that we call Koine Greek. Koine Greek was like the everyday spoken Greek. It wasn't the sophisticated literary Greek of like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And that's what the New Testament's in. The New Testament, for the most part, with the possible exception maybe of Hebrews, but the New Testament, for the most part, is in this Koine Greek, just everyday spoken language, not the sophisticated language. That's who these Christians were. That's what they made up. But the fourth thing I want to mention about the social world of the time was absolutely the biggest social reality of early Christianity was the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, especially the power of the Roman emperor. This was the biggest social reality. This was political and social, of course. I mean, you know, systems and structures, economy, all of political, they were all dependent on the Roman Empire. But it was also religious. Look at what you see on the screen there. There was a significant element of what we call emperor worship. That is, the Roman emperors were seen as divine, and they demanded to be worshipped as gods. And this was all over the first century world. So imagine being a Christian into that environment. We're going to see a lot about the Roman Empire and even emperor worship as we go through that. And we're going to see especially that much of the New Testament is a critique and an alternative to empire. Like over and over again, we're going to see it. The New Testament has this idea that there's an alternative kingdom with a new kind of king. We're going to see that as we go along. But lots of the New Testament writing is this critique of empire and claims to power and an alternative to empire. Okay, so just thinking a little bit about the social world. There is one last element that I want to mention before I wrap this up today, and that is, as part of these overlapping large backgrounds, what about the Greco-Roman world, religion and philosophy? Like, what was in the air religiously and philosophically when early Christianity and the New Testament writings began to be written? Here's a good way to get a quick grasp on this. How many of you remember the series of books, Percy Jackson and the Olympians? Maybe you saw some of these books, or maybe you remember the movie that was made, Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. You remember? So you remember in the books or the movie, Percy Jackson is supposed to be the son of Poseidon or Neptune, and he's a demigod, and he's half god and half human, and he goes on these kind of mythological adventures with his fellow demigods and so on and so forth. Okay, here's why I bring that up. When we talk about the non-Jewish religious world of the first century, we're mostly talking about the worship of the Greek and Roman gods and goddesses, what we today would sort of call Greek and Roman mythology. So like Greek gods like Zeus and Hera, Athena, or Roman gods like Jupiter and Venus, things like that. There were other religions around too, of course, but this is primarily what we talk about when we talk about the Greco-Roman world, religion and philosophy. Now, there's a lot of debate over exactly how much the early Christians were influenced by non-Jewish religion, because we know how important Judaism was. And scholars haven't been able to show that these religions shaped New Testament theology in dominant ways, but they definitely factored in to the audience that the New Testament writers address. So there's even one point in Acts, we'll see when we get there, where the crowds at a certain place meet Paul and Barnabas, and they think Paul and Barnabas are Zeus and Hermes, these Greek gods, sort of come in the flesh. So it was definitely a part of the audience and the background. But again, I want to end by saying the biggest one to mention when talking about religion and philosophy is Roman emperor worship. One of the biggest things we'll see as we go through, especially for the books like Revelation in the New Testament, is this idea that the Roman emperor was seen as divine and demanded to be worshipped as a god. So that was in the air as part of the religious and philosophical world of early Christianity and the New Testament writings. You can see a statue there of Augustus Caesar, who was the Roman emperor during the time of Jesus's life, for example. All right, so there's our first step into the kind of broader historical context, the overlapping three contexts of Hellenism, the Roman Empire, Greco-Roman world, and first century Judaism. You're doing some reading about first century Judaism, in other words, Second Temple Judaism and apocalyptic thought. But in the next lecture, we'll be continuing again with just a little bit more of the origins, composition, and backgrounds of the New Testament before we jump into the Gospels. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the share and keep up with the reading and the assignments, and I will see you very soon online. Shalom.